Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin talking to Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. A lot of snow still in Krakow. 55 centimeters this past week.
What is that in real measurement?
What is it? I don't even know, but it's a lot.
Well, I hope you manage okay, and it's pretty balmy here in North Texas, where you've abandoned me, but I'm making do. We're excited today, aren't we, Bobby? Because we are talking to one of the great thinkers, I think, in kind of the Catholic philosophical, cultural conversations, all the things that are going on that we're interested in. And we're talking to D.C. Schindler, who is professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America. That's a lot of title. The two words that I love best about your title, David, are metaphysics and anthropology, which to my mind are kind of the two biggest crisis issues that we are facing in the world today. So you have a tall task, but welcome, David, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on this with you and to see Bobby again, whom I knew as a student 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Anyway, a while back.
Yeah, 10 years ago.
About 10 years ago. Okay.
The time flies by really quickly. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I remember those classes fondly. Yes. I think I started, Being His Gift was my first class, and but I learned of you much early. I learned about your work earlier, and I was actually super excited to be taking a class with you because I read this article you wrote on Plato on money. I thought, oh my gosh! I mean, who brings Plato with money together? And it was just, to me, it was like such a revelation, and I knew I had to come to the Institute because I knew that the communio, communion was pretty much housed there. So then I met your father before I met you, and that was quite I always think back on those times very fondly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, David, let's jump right into it. Now, one of the big issues one of the big things that's kind of in the water is this question of liberalism and post-liberalism, what all of that means and where it's all going. Now, we know you have a new book that we want to talk to you about a little bit, but we want to maybe first back up a little bit because I really enjoyed your book, The Politics of the Real. And I'd love to just ask you a couple of things about that, maybe kind of in generalities, in particular that first chapter of that book. I've recommended it to a bunch of people where you ask this question, what is liberalism? And let me just read you one line, and maybe you can use this as a jumping off point to tell us something here. I thought this was really provocative and really got me thinking in a good way. So you wrote, it is a matter of straightforward historical fact that what defines liberalism in its origins is a rejection of Christianity. And there's more, but so that's kind of out of context. Right. But tell us more.
Yeah, no, that is provocative because since from the beginning there have been efforts to try to reconcile Christianity and liberalism, and in fact, some very serious people who have made good arguments, relatively strong arguments that liberalism embodies it's the offspring of Christianity, and that you wouldn't, liberalism, it's not an accident that it appeared in the West because the West was formed by Christianity, so it's intelligible only as an offshoot. And I think there's actually a lot of truth to that. But offshoot can mean a number of things, and I do think it's not an accident that it arose in the West, but and also, and I'll explain this in just a moment, it's also true that there are a number of the basic features of liberalism that have the roots in Christianity. There's no question, but it seems to me, and the point that I was making there in the book is that. And as I say, it's a matter of historical fact. This is not difficult to show that the thrust of it, the what accounts for its emergence, what really prompts it in the first place, is an effort to rethink human society, the way of organizing human life in this world, somehow outside of the authority of, I say Christianity there, but when you think of Christianity in terms of it, of the tradition and the institution and the authority, you're talking about the Catholic Church. So liberalism, in a way, is an attempt to try to make way in the world as an alternative to the way that had been given in and through the Catholic Church. So in that sense, it's very much an anti-Catholic, anti in the etymological sense. It's anti-Catholic institution. Now, in doing that, obviously, and one's always defined by one's enemies, right? So I mean, that doesn't mean that Christianity and liberalism have nothing in common. Quite the contrary. One could say that a great deal of the substance of, in fact, arguably all of the substance of liberalism owes itself to Christianity. But the problem is it's been stolen, you might say. It is the offspring. Somebody once described it as the offspring of Christianity as a kind of a natural child as opposed to a legitimate one. There's that's not a bad way to look at it, but it seems to me that it borrows from Christianity in the mode of a kind of parasitical in a parasitical mode rather than in the filial mode. So I mean, which isn't to say that that everything in it is evil. It's to say that in fact, everything in it, in a certain sense, has its roots in something good, but it's taken a kind of a perverse form that over time is going to show itself, and has, I think, now been showing itself pretty clearly as a force for destruction, disorder. So I've covered a lot of ground there, but if there was some piece of that you'd like to maybe focus on, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Maybe I'll just follow up real quick on just this question of the real, because it seems to me, you make the point in the book, but it's just, it's so obvious to anyone. I mean, there's no such thing as neutrality, right? Like we don't live in the theoretical realm. Like we have to live in reality. And so, so we're living in a kind of, an alternate reality, I guess, like compared to the real.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny in a way. Virtual reality has existed for centuries, when we're just now discovering the technology to make it a thing. But in a way, that's exactly the point, and that would be a certain way to look at it. What is exactly what is reality? What is a thing? What are real things? And there's so much to reflect on and unpack there. But one of the, and this is something actually I'm hoping to work on in the not too distant future, to work out some details of this a little more systematically. But anyway, things are part of human existence and human community. We gather. Heidegger had some great insights about this, that things are realities around which we gather and form community. There's something about the concreteness of a thing, and especially if you interpret it in the classical tradition, in light of the teaching on the convertibility of the transcendentals. Real things, precisely insofar as they are real at all, reflect goodness and truth and beauty, and these are essential to human life. We can't exist as human without them, and we cultivate these things in things. But when you step outside of an actual real tradition, and it'll sound like I'm making a leap here. One would have to fill in the spaces, but when you step outside of a tradition, you're actually breaking with you're fragmenting the bonds and the substance of the community in which things have their proper place, and it transforms our relationship with everything. It tends then to become, what's the difference between a thing that you've grown up with and inherited a kind of connection to and a certain responsibility for, and disposable objects that are just simply the options presented that can be chosen today and disregarded tomorrow. You don't connect to them, even if the content is very similar. You don't connect to them in the same way at all. And it seems to me that's a subtle point. But I think as we reflect on it, you see that kind of the difference that I'm talking about there, you see reflected in all sorts of dimensions of society. This is something I think that's becoming a dominant experience for all of us, many of us, maybe all of us.
You talk about like the tradition and the handing on, and just at the moment I was thinking of just the body of, you inherit, basically in some ways the familial makeup of the whole past. And then you think of the body being a term that's used for not only like the body politic, but then the church and the body of Christ. And so, all of that kind of handing on, and then you're mentioning of liberalism as being kind of a break in that, and then a remaking, but yet totally indebted in some sense to, and becoming parasitical. In your working this out, I think in many respects, you're connecting a lot of this to like the body of Christ, and the Eucharist. How does the Eucharist play a role in I know that Heidegger in one of his essays mentions, like, he almost has, like, did he talk about a chalice in the question concerning technology? And I always wondered, did he ever really break off from his Catholic past? But how much is that in some ways latent or in his thought?
Well, let me I'm going to break up your question into two parts, and first just a comment about the body very briefly, and then I'll talk about the Eucharist. But the observations I was just making a moment ago about our connection to things that we inherit and we're bound to, and the body in a way is the paradigm of that. Our own body. I mean, think about it. It's sort of in and through the body that your most fundamental relationships are established. First through your mother, the umbilical cord that connected you to your mother, and the relationship between your mother and father which is a bodily relationship, and the blood that courses through your veins, and this is, we talk about bloodlines, your family in a way. I mean, all these things are connected to your body, but it's also, it's in your body that you stand on the earth, and that you live in a particular place, and that you can connect with other people and communicate. The body is sort of a focal point for all of these things. And think about then the difference. If that's the case, and we recognize our body as a given reality, into which we're born, with which we're born, and we discover our identity precisely in this deep connection with the body, and as a place precisely where we become accessible to others, in the world. That's one conception. Then another conception where we think of it as something that was assigned to us, that was like imposed on us by birth. And therefore, in principle, even if it's difficult to make this work still technologically, in principle, it's something that can be exchanged. It's a fungible reality, and it can be made what we want it to be. I mean, that there's no more profound transformation in our relationship to everything and everyone, it seems to me. Okay, so that's one. About the Eucharist, I'm glad that you made the connection with Heidegger there too. It seems to me, arguably what he was trying to do was to try to give everything in the world the kind of significance of the Eucharist. You know, he was trying to invest it with this divine presence. And I think there's something really profound to that. I wouldn't dismiss it right out of hand. But it's very different if you think of that as substituting for the reality of the Eucharist, or as an analogous extension of this reality that remains the central, pivotal, and referential, reference point for everything else. There again, you end up with two very different pictures of reality.
Mhm.
These are very deep questions.
Well, no, I just, I mean, I don't want to go too far off, but I feel like I'm almost walking on. I have to be careful of me even mentioning this book, but I've mentioned it before because the book is bigger than my house. It's Eugene McCrair's book, and at the end, he meant of the book, what's it called? The Enchantments of Mammon. And
Yeah.
I like the romantic parts. I realized, and I was talking to Andrew about this, that man, I'm such a romantic. Those like John Ruskin, all those types,
Yeah.
they're my guys, And anyways, but he mentions that, Heaven Kelly, I think, from Wired magazine, talks about technology as if it's going to have almost like the chip will be this focal point for this new civilization, that the chip will replace the Eucharist as that reference point. And so he's calling for a kind of return I think this is near the end of the book, where it's like, no, like we've got the focal point. It's the Eucharist. And yet that will kind of maybe be the grounds for this rebuilding, and in a kind of in the romantic way that he sees fit. And he ends with saying we need to return to not Saint Benedict maybe, but Saint Francis of Assisi in the city. And so anyways, I was just when you mentioned like body and you mentioned kind of tradition, like reference points and all that, it just seems to me that we were talking to Carl Olson. Sorry, actually, Carl Anderson was in Krakow this week, so I'm confusing him with Carl. But Carl Olson was talking about how the Eucharist, is just so primary with connecting that to eschatology, with ecclesiology. And then Andrew and I were about Europe, and it just seems to me Europe, in some ways, is not to get too, I don't know, to overdo it too much, but I look around Poland and it is marked with the signs of the faith, but it's a Eucharistic land. So
it's funny that you mentioned Jane's book. He and I were colleagues. Did you know that for many years? So
Villanova. I forgot about that.
Yeah. He also was one who introduced me to John Ruskin in a class that we taught together. So we've had a number of conversations when he was still in the early stages of his book. The idea, I mean, it really is a provocative image to think of the chip as the Eucharist of the future, or something like that. But think about, I mean, that's illuminating in all sorts of ways. What's the same and what's different, and what does it mean to have something that replaces, that substitutes for, I mean, and here's the thing that some people, and this, to tie it back to the liberalism question, you might say, well, look at all these elements in liberalism that are very, that are Christian. It would be similar to saying, look at all these elements in the chip that are similar to the Eucharist. They're just like the Eucharist. Now, that similarity, I mean, it's diabolical.
Communication.
It's not right. There are all kinds of things that you can point to, and those things are true, and they're also good. But you see, it's profoundly different. Like what the integrating principle is, and simply sharing the elements is not sufficient. There has to be a real, actual connection with, and that connection is going to tie it to a very particular place and time and a very particular history as well. You can't just in an abstract way, gather up the elements and bring them together and have something that more or less functions the same. I mean, if you do, you're equating the point with functionality, you see. I mean, there's no way to do it that's actually true unless you reintegrate to the original the original thing in the original history. So right, I mean the chip in its pure abstraction, there's nothing we can you had mentioned prior to the beginning here Hegel, it's interesting. One of the things that he thought, one of the biggest criticisms that he made of Catholics was that we contemplate and adore the Eucharist. And for Hegel, the whole point of the Eucharist is to be eaten. There's no point in looking at it. It's meant to be eaten. And you see, so that's a profound difference. It's also for us to be eaten. It wouldn't exist if it weren't meant to be eaten, but it has an extraordinary meaning already in itself, and not simply in the function that it serves. And we can adore the Eucharist, but we couldn't adore a chip. I mean, think about that. Think about the perversity of that. And it's because a chip is pure functionality, you see.
David, I'm a former Anglican, and actually one of the articles of the famous 39 Articles of Religion from the classical Book of Common Prayer is, I forget the exact wording now, but is the Lord's Supper is not to be carried about and gazed upon. It's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Like, there's this sort of almost, and it's strange because it's almost a kind of utilitarian view of, it's almost like a kind of caricature of what Catholics think about sacraments. Like, namely, they're just like grace pills, so you need to just like take them and let them do their thing, right? But actually, the reality is, it's a thing that is powerful in a lot of different ways, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, right. It's a thing in itself, and it's it has its meaning fully in itself, and also fully in what it communicates. Mm-hmm. And those are not to be separated. Right. So and the problem is we've and this is why somebody like Heidegger is actually important. When he wants to try to re-enchant things. I was critical of that as a substitute for the sacraments. But I want to come back to it now, say something positive. It seems to me, unless we have some sense of reality in general, having a symbolic dimension and having a kind of a sacred dimension, having something of the presence of God, then we're not going to properly appreciate what a sacrament is. So what happens in a world in which we have totally instrumentalized all of reality, and then we have these things called sacraments, they suddenly tend to be reduced to, as you say, like the grace pill. They become themselves, talismans or magic or technologies of a sort. So that's why it's a complex thing that we need to simultaneously restore our sense of the meaning of the Eucharist and restore our sense of the sacramental character of reality. And each of those depends in some way on the other, but it becomes, you start to recognize the enormity of this. And this is why so much of the integralist debate gets, at a certain point, gets sort of tiresome for me, because it becomes so much just a matter of intra-ecclesial politics. And it is obviously an ecclesial thing, but you can't properly understand the church unless you also rethink the nature of society and politics and economics. These things depend on each other. The absolute uniqueness of the church and the analogical extension of the meaning of the church into the whole of reality.
Yeah, real quick, and Bobby, I know you want to get back in here, but I'll just note that I just, glancing back at your Politics of the Real book this morning, I noticed that you made the point that there has been a tendency maybe among Catholics who are, broadly in sympathy with each other, but differ on this question of whether we can be liberal or not liberal or something, to say, hey, look, let's we agree on the same doctrine, but the way we organize society, well, that's a little murkier, and we can kind of agree to disagree or whatever. And you kind of say, well, you can't really do that. I mean, not really, because it all impinges. It's like, I went to Yale Divinity School and I studied with Miroslav Volf, and he used to say, I have mixed feelings about him, but he used to say that, Christian doctrine was like trying to stuff too many clothes into a suitcase. And so you're always like trying to, get them all in there. And there's always like a sleeve sticking out or like whatever, but it's all got to fit in there,
Yeah.
So anyway.
That's not a bad image. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not that there's only one way of organizing society possible. It's analogous, but analogous means simultaneously a unity and difference. So, infinite possibilities, but they're all going to be infinite possibilities of the same truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that's why it's not a matter of indifference, what the social order looks like.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, Dr. Schindler, you've been writing a lot about just the good and retrieving I remember reading a book that you wrote on Plato. And then like more recently, you've been, writing a lot about like Pseudo-Dionysus and his understanding of the good. But as we've been talking about, even you mentioned about like Hegel, in that the Eucharist is meant to be consumed, not, gazed upon. But, with the both, that needs to be there. And you mentioned in partially some of your, great admiration of Hegel as like one of the best philosophers who ever lived, but also kind of critiquing his kind of exhaustive account of Christianity, which by exhaustive meaning that there's no mystery at the end of the day. It just basically, it all is reduced to, in some ways, I don't know what the proper Hegelian terms are, but that you just kind of know it all because there's nothing yet to, in some ways, wait upon to be revealed, or there's no fullness and mystery that is yet to be disclosed. So no wonder. And so I was thinking in terms of like the Eucharist, equating the Eucharist with the good, with this kind of more kind of pseudo-Dionysian account, maybe actually a proper response to somebody like a Hegel, so that the mystery is still maintained with like the mystery, the Eucharist.
That's right. No, that's a profound point. That this is for there's so many things that connect up here. Let me just start with this. For Hegel, in a way, that the connection between gazing at the Eucharist and the abiding mystery, if it's held out before you, it remains other than you. There's a kind of a distance between you and it. For Hegel, the whole point, God revealed himself precisely to eliminate that difference. He wanted to give himself so fully and completely that there was nothing left. There was nothing held back. And we want to say, well, that's true in some sense, but it's the very nature of the good and love and proper sense of transcendence that the complete giving of oneself does not eliminate the abiding transcendence of the giver. I mean, quite the contrary. And that's why that distance is never over. I mean, it's both overcome and it remains. and that's the essence of the mystery of love. What you have in Dionysius is this notion of a kind of a reciprocity. You don't just have goodness that it feeds our eros, but the good that gives itself also is eros, and so in a way seeks us. It's not just the object of our seeking. And that transforms the meaning. Why is it that as a Catholic we can gaze upon the Eucharist? I hadn't thought of it in these terms before just now, but I mean, one of the reasons, it seems to me, is that we have the sense that the Eucharist desires us. that Christ present in the Eucharist is desires us. It's not just an object of our subjectivity as it would be for Hegel. And that, there you get the infinite mirrors bouncing off each other, and it just goes on to infinity. This is why there's never any worry of it running out. I used to worry when I was in. I used to get into panics when I was in college. I remember thinking, having these experience of Eros and the mystery of the world unfolding and realizing that that's all I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And then the terror of what happens if it runs dry? Then what am I going to do? And that really concerned me. But I've come in my older age to realize there's no danger there. The mystery will never ever run out.
Same. I was always afraid of boredom. Like it's like, okay, so you reach, the eschaton, right? Heaven and earth have met, and yet you're in his glory, and yet then you're just, okay, next, what's next?
Yeah. Well, I mean, does this open up a whole new can of worms? That's one of the things that I think is the worry about things like technology, because and social media and so forth. I mean, the habits that we're all forming with this, it does. We all recognize, right, that the more we use these things, the chances of our becoming bored grow. That we become more inclined to boredom and a need for distraction. Now, the thing is, the concern about technology, to my mind, is not in the first place moral. It's much more profoundly the way that it forms our souls. And if Plato is right, so Plato said that the only thing that we bring with us into the afterworld is our education. The one possession is our education. And I mean, it seems to me what that means is however your soul is formed in this world, that abides. And if we have rendered our soul incapable of receiving deeply, then our experience of eternity is going to be impoverished. And that really is, regardless of the question of heaven or hell, just think about it in those terms. There's something really urgently at stake in how we form our souls, or allow our souls to be formed in this world. Does that make sense what I'm getting at? I didn't put it so well. But.
Yeah. Is resurrected me going to be the me that is addicted to social media or something?
Yeah.
It is a weird thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously there's a physiological dimension to that. And we would say, well, your body is transformed. Yeah. But I also think the habits of the soul are formed. And it may be that we become superficial. And so that we might be, having the beatific vision, but we're going to have it more superficially than we might have otherwise if we had actually formed our souls properly.
That's pretty mind-blowing, David. I have to say that this is fantastic. Let's stay on this theme, and maybe
I'm actually getting nervous as I'm saying.
No.
Oh my goodness, what are the implications of this point? But
well, let's downshift then just to kind of eschatology writ large, because this is an issue that Bobby and I are really interested in our work in this new endeavor we're doing, the Space Salvi Institute. We, maybe to pick up your point, I mean, we think that eschatology is something that is largely ignored, and not only by everyday people, but church-going people who really are believing Christians. And Bobby brought up the article. We've been talking about Hegel a little bit, but you wrote an article for the Evangelization and Culture Journal about Hegel and eschatology. And I maybe you could say a little bit more about that, because here was a big takeaway I had about this was, so we think of, so those of our listeners who aren't that into philosophy, bear with us for a minute, because I think that this is important stuff, right? We're thinking about what's the point of anything, in a sense.
Yeah.
So there are, like, I always thought, okay, there's like right Hegelians and left Hegelians, and they all kind of believe, like, we're progressing towards something. And so you hear like, left-wing Hegelian types talk about a certain vision of progress, and right-wing types a different vision of progress or whatever. Right. But something that I think you bring out in this article that is really pertinent to all people who call themselves Christians is to remember that, in a sense, Hegel's right that we are progressing, like we're going towards something, like and so like the kind of like right-wing liberal truism about like don't immanentize the eschaton is, it's kind of like partly right if you're reading like a church bulletin and they have the mission statement on there that says we're building God's kingdom or like whatever. It's kind of like, yeah, no, that's not really what we're doing. But the kingdom has come near. It has, right? Yeah. And so the eschaton is imminent. So anyway, I'm just going to throw it back to you, that kind of mess of eschatological stuff.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. It is the case that the kingdom of God is not of this world, but we also know that doesn't exclude the possibility that it is in this world. And in fact, I mean, that's the gospel message, right? To be in the world, but not of the world. And so whatever the Christian transformation is, it actually does concern the way we live in this world, and the way we establish our existence. It's not something simply to worry about in the future. And there are many implications to that point, but just one simple part of it is a recognition that, I mean, in fact, as spiritual creatures, we often call it, we will often say things like, well, we're finite human beings, we're temporal, we're confined to a certain space, and we're temporal creatures. We're not simply temporal. To the extent that we're spiritual, we're never simply temporal, actually. And even our experience of time is the experience of time of a soul that is dwelling already in some sense in eternity. And there's the things that we do and think, and the relationships that we have are already a kind of anticipation. They're already a kind of participation in the final state. So eschatological questions bear immediately on us now. That's the gist of it.
So kind of the fullness. I'm sorry, Andrew.
No, go ahead.
No. I'm just saying, like, with the fullness. I know there's some, you hear the term eschaton and the unveiling and this fullness, the absolute, perhaps. Sometimes you hear that thrown around. I know there's a book that was like very much critiqued, but I have to admit I kind of liked it. David Bentley Hart's latest book. But the sense of just like that. All things in some ways are going to are in some ways, how do I put this, actually are moving towards their full participation and in the fullness itself. And it just seems to me, Andrew, you mentioned like the left Hegelians. I'm thinking just specifically those because right now I have to teach a bunch of like 20th century history, and I'm like, the students are always asking me, well, my gosh, these people are so, on fire for these revolutionary causes. And yet, in Russia, this like ignites, this whole, and what gets them going? I mean, this is recent history. And like, even like we're talking about the experiences with the end of the Cold War, but like where are we now? But yet what got that all those societies motivated to go towards something? And it just seems to me that like this is partially why I'm like, Europe is eschatological, because either it's going to have that, I don't want to say just Europe, but like, like insofar Christendom it's going to be moving towards the heavenly Jerusalem. If you don't have that, clearly and well articulated, it's going to come up in so many other ways. And you see that with like, the appeal of Marx. And then what would motivate somebody like a Lenin and Stalin, some ways, to do atrocious things, to get to that. But like Andrew and I were talking about the movie Lives of Others, and it's interesting that the director. I'm sorry, I'm going around a lot here, but the director Florian, what's his name? Florian von Dammersmark.
Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck.
Oh yeah. Well, he said that the motivation for making that movie was he heard this line from Lenin that he could no longer listen to Beethoven anymore because it made him soft, and he just wanted to caress the heads of the people when he listened to Beethoven because it was so beautiful. And yet he stopped listening to the music because he had to move on with, and he had to smash their heads in to complete the revolution. And so I had the students, I had the students reflect on this with the revolutions, as if, and in that movie, there's a scene in which when they're going and searching his house for the first time, and there's one book that's shown that you see that clearly the title, the author, and it's Solzhenitsyn, and you think, okay, beauty will save the world. And so you think, okay, well, what was capable of changing the heart of that, Stasi operator was the beauty of the lives of the others. But yet, in some sense, they all had some inkling of what beauty is. Perhaps maybe it is the, ultimately communism. But yet that wasn't fully it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the tragedy of all of this is that, we in the 21st century will look, in astonishment at how passionate people were, and the in the 20th century that they were willing to gather up the whole of their lives and commit it to these causes in a way that was so destructive and violent, and caused such an upheaval. And so the lesson that we take is that that passion is in error, what is a sign of a kind of a madness and a profound confusion and ignorance and so forth. I mean, the problem is it's so much more complicated than that, because in a certain sense, so we think that there's nothing really worth getting worked up about. So our lesson is then, just chill and not get so worked up about things. And the problem is that kind of passion is profoundly human. It's human to be that way. And the tragedy is that genuinely true human mode was directed to something that was anti-human, but it drew on the energies that were meant for true fulfillment and the true eschaton. What we need to do is we need to be able to appreciate the tragedy of this, and rather than say that it's not really worth living for something like that, or we need to get over this idea that history has a meaning, and that there are things that are worth working for. We need to recover a sense of the profound passion for the ultimate meaning of things, but once again, sort of in the tradition that we've inherited, to rediscover this actually in the Christian tradition rather than a substitute for it.
Yeah. And to come back to the technology issue, it does seem like the point of technology, in as much as there is one, and I think often there isn't, at least not one that's understood by the people who are creating the things that they sell to us, is to create this sort of flattened out reality, is to make us not passionate, right? Is to just give us more things to kind of sedate us all with a faux happiness that is very anti-human.
It is, and I mean, it's so worrisome. I mean, this is what it means to be bourgeois in the end, and that was one of the motivating discoveries that generated liberalism, was this idea that if we could turn the whole world into business partners, we'd never have a war again, because everybody would be contentedly bargaining for mediocre self-interest, and these great passions wouldn't exist anymore, and that was sort of an ideal. And that, you know, I think that the problem is that that exceeded way beyond probably what anyone would have hoped for. Wendell Berry, in his he has this beautiful essay on what's it called, the body and the earth. And it's interesting. He doesn't draw attention to what he's doing in one part of that essay, but he uses the passions of joy and grief as sort of reference points. It was kind of interesting for me to think about that. Joy, we all obviously desire. We all want to be happy. And we think, well, but I'd be very happy to do without grief. Grief seems like something that nobody really wants. But he was presenting both of these as a kind of an ideal, and I realized the more I thought about it, they're inseparable from each other, and they have to do with this deep connection to things. So much so that if you're incapable of grief, you're also going to be incapable of joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, another way of describing that flattening that you're speaking of is that we are increasingly incapable of joy and grief, and that's a sign of the fact that we're increasingly detached from the most important things. We're detached from.
Yeah, I just to kind of put a bow on what you're saying, the joy and grief thing is something I thought a lot about from my reading of C.S. Lewis, who I think really nails that point. I mean, they're always flip sides of the same coin. And so interesting to me that he was, on a related note, somebody who was, I think, such a prophet about technology, you know, with the Abolition of Man and with his Ransom trilogy, the space trilogy, especially the last book, That Hideous Strength. Anyway, just a comment, but I think about that a lot.
Yeah, you know, and I worry about, you know, this detachment. I was just at a licentiate thesis defense a few days ago, and the priest there was describing this spiritual vision of a 20th century religious, a woman that's remarkable in all sorts of ways. But he was talking about the emphasis she gave to detachment and how important it is to be detached from things and spiritual detachment. And I stopped and I said, you know, is that right? It seems to me, have Christians perhaps colluded in this improper detachment from reality by associating with a kind of spiritual perfection? I mean, you know, if and the example he was giving is these nuns had to become detached from their sisters in their community who might be called to found another community, and they need to be able to let them go. And I said, okay, what's the difference between? Can you imagine the sisters that were just perfectly happy, you know, or entirely indifferent whether they stayed or went, versus those that actually suffered their loss, but still wanted to go? And it seems to me, obviously, we all recognize suffering their departure is a perfection, and that's a sign of attachment. So it seems to me it's not so much the question of detachment; it's deepening attachments and expanding them, you know, so that you remain attached to them when they're in a different monastery, but you're still attached.
Yeah, people who are detached are like psychopaths, right? I mean, it's really a strange,
by definition. Yeah. That's right. But I mean, does that mean we have to rethink this whole long Christian tradition about spiritual detachment? What do we make of that? What do you guys make of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was on Thursdays. I have conversations with Carmelites and Dominicans, and so with the Discalced Carmelites, I was asking them actually a little bit about John of the Cross the other day, and I said, you know, I got like a presentation of John of the Cross, which really stressed the nada. You know, that kind of the nada, and I'm like, okay, is there something, you know, I don't know what the opposite of the nada, but like a yes to something. And they're like, absolutely. And they actually agreed that the kind of attachment is not actually presented enough. And John of the Cross was definitely attached to many things. But kind of on this note though too, of like and Andrew, if you want to share some thoughts here too, but one of the inspirations behind the Spe Salvi too is actually Piggy, and like we were talking about like attachment, detachment, but the idea of pilgrimage, and you mentioned education, but like when I was thinking about education, I was working for Word on Fire, it was like pilgrimage, 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 and like the allegory of the cave almost is like a pilgrimage. And then, but this idea of attaching oneself, like your heart is attached to the ultimate destination, okay? But yet at the same time, you have to detach from, but yet it's all in some ways being brought with you to the kind of ultimate point, that fullness. And so I just wanted to mention too, Dr. Schindler, that we had to read this at the John Paul II Institute. And I have to admit, when I first started reading it, I didn't see the profundity of it, but over the years, it
Bobby,
just
say what it is for our listeners who aren't watching.
Sorry, the Portal of the Mystery of Hope. The Portal of the Mystery of Hope. And Dr. Schindler, I saw years later, translated it. And so I was like, oh my gosh. So, but like around the time after I read this, I saw Terrence, not to throw too much in here, but I saw Terrence Malick's Tree of Life. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's just so much here with like the concreteness of this, but at the same time, the concrete, like lived reality still has this transcendent dimension to it. And yet it's not like just some kind of like, okay, away with the concreteness and, also there's no narrative, but everything has this eschatological dimension in that movie. And the same thing here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and the eschatological, I mean, you mentioned Piggy. I mean, first of all, it's amazing. I have to say, I think this is like the 6th time Piggy has been referenced in the last week in totally different contexts. He seems to be coming up all the time now. I'm wondering if we're in a moment of a kind of resurgence, and I really hope that we are, because I think he's one of the most extraordinary paradigms of the Catholic spirit that I've ever encountered, really. But you mentioned hope. Hope is obviously eschatologically oriented, but as you see in Piggy so beautifully, there's no leaving behind. It's a gathering up. He was profoundly, in ways that I'm still trying to make sense of. He was profoundly attached to France and to his particular region of France, and to his family, and to his grandmother and the work that she did in the soil. There's something so concrete, and none of those things, he doesn't detach from those in order to move towards the future. He gathers them up as fully and completely as he can to bring them along with him, even to the point, and I know that I've read this somewhere, I've never been able to find it again. If either of you know the passage or you ever come across it, but Peggy at some point mentions that the very stones of the cathedrals are going to be in the eschaton. Does that ring a bell for anyone? I know that I've read that in Piggy. I need to read. I've hunted through, and I don't know where it was, but I think it's a really important point. And it recalls to us the density and the concreteness and the thingliness of Christian life.
You mentioned Wendell Berry earlier, and I'm thinking of the chapter of Jaber Crow, his novel Jaber Crow, where Jaber he's the janitor at this church, among other things. He's the town barber and stuff, but he once a week comes in and cleans the church, and he's reflecting on the experience that the people have in this church every week. And he says, like, it's this little town, so they get these like rotating, fresh out of Bible college preachers coming through, and they all preach this like hellfire and brimstone, anti-world, the world is evil stuff. And he says, the problem with that is nobody believes it. Nobody.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the same people who sit there and listen to that harangue every week are the same people who put on their most beautiful dresses once a week, who after
Yeah.
church go and make, drink, buttermilk and make these beautiful biscuits and fried chicken. And they invite the pastor to come over with them. And he always comes. He always comes because he likes it too. It's like, we don't hate stuff. We don't. And so, I love that emphasis that you're placing there on kind of that it will all be redeemed. This world is not destined for the trash can. It's destined for resurrection.
Yeah. I always think of that. I think it's from Jaber Crow. I think it's from that. No, but he tells a story about some of the ne'er-do-wells drinking in the woods, but pouring the big bottle of whiskey, as it pours it out, you hear good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. There's a kind of an affirmation even in this, maybe wouldn't get immediate approval from the powers that be. But there's a sense that a celebration of life is more basic to us than perhaps the rules that we establish.
Yeah.
In our convention.
Well, yeah. Well, in the time that remains, we'd love to hear about your new book, which is just out. Would you tell us what it is?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. It was written a while ago, but it's taken some time for it to come out. It's a small book called. In fact, hold on one second. Here it is. I think that's showing up backwards on it, but God in the City is the name of the book, an essay in political metaphysics, and they're three short essays bound together, trying to offer a succinct argument that rather than getting engaged in some of the debates about liberalism and integralism and those sorts of things, the effort was just to enter into fundamental questions about what politics, what is the purpose of political community, and how does God enter into this political sphere? What's as a not in the first place from a theological perspective, but more basically from a philosophical perspective. So it's a kind of as I say, political metaphysics, thinking through the nature of human community with a view to the theological transformation.
Well, that sounds great.
Yeah, I was there at the talk when you delivered it.
So it was prompted. The writing of it was prompted by the talks I gave for the Aquinas lecture at the University of Dallas, or talks. There was just one talk, and that's mostly from the central chapter of this book. But I expanded it on both sides and kind of gave it a context for the written version here. But I've been anxious for this to come out because I'm really hopeful to see I'm interested in seeing what sort of reception the argument gets and to hear some feedback. But
well, so maybe we can maybe we can have you back on once we've had a chance to read it and digest it. And I do hope anyone listening would pick up a copy of that. For now, we are just grateful, DC Schindler, for the time that you've been able to spend with us. To our listeners and viewers, if you liked what you have seen and heard here, please do share this podcast with friends, like it, give us a good 5-star review, and be sure to check out our website, spacesalviinstitute.com. Is that right, Bobby? I always get the website wrong.
That's right. That's right.
spacesalviinstitute.com. Sign up for our email list. We've got some great new essays on there. The podcasts are coming out regularly. So until next time, God bless and live in hope.